The early history of Spain is obscure, being preserved for us by the Greek writers mostly in the form of mythical tales which, as I shall proceed to demonstrate, are written in a style of writing known as Allegory. The Greek writer Herodotus called the original inhabitants of Spain Geryones, informing us that they settled in the island called by the Greeks Erythea, on the shore of the ocean near Gadara, outside the Pillars of Heracles. The Pillars of Heracles are known to us today as the Straits of Gibraltar. Erythea is the island on which the city of Cadiz now stands. Hesiod, another Greek writer, describes Geryon, their king, as the three-headed god of the underworld, whilst Apollodorus and Aeschylus both describe him as being three men joined at the waist. There is no contradiction here. This is allegory. We shall look at this story in more detail shortly, when we shall explain its true meaning. The date of arrival of the Phoenicians in Spain is likewise shrouded in mystery. Even the British archaeologist Barry Cunliffe, Emeritus Professor of European Archaeology at Oxford University, admits that the archaeological evidence for a Phoenician settlement in Spain is somewhat lacking. He writes, Gadara, the ancient historians claimed, was founded about 1100 BC by a group of Phoenicians from Tyre. The archaeological evidence, however, does not bear this out. On the mainland, just opposite Gadara, there is no real trace of Phoenician influence before about 770 to 760 BC. I should perhaps mention that Gadara is yet another ancient name for the city which is today known as Cadiz. It should be noted that the city of Cadiz today is so densely populated that it makes any excavation there impossible. The name Cadiz is an Arabic word and has only been used for the name of this city since around the 8th century of the Common Era. Cadiz is the Arabic equivalent of the Hebrew word Kadesh or Kodesh, meaning holy, hence meaning holy place or holy city. The Phoenicians, however, called the city Gadir, which in Hebrew means fence, wall, barrier or similar. The Latin writer Pliny even informs us that Gadir means fence. Pliny likewise believed that the island on which the city of Cadiz stood was called Erythea because the Tyrians, the original ancestors of the Carthagenians, were said to have come from the Erythean or Red Sea. Notice then that these Tyrians from the city of Tyre in northern Israel came from the Red Sea. Does that by any chance ring any bells? Was this not where King Solomon built his fleet of ships? Did he not do so with the assistance of the king of Tyre? Hold that thought firmly in mind. In this video presentation, we shall endeavour to show who these Phoenicians actually were, and in the process, we shall reveal their precise date of arrival in Spain. Most textbooks tell us that the Phoenicians were Canaanites, but, believe it or not, the Phoenicians never once claimed to be Canaanites. This is a common misconception. The Canaanites were a black Hamitic people, whilst the Phoenicians were Semitic, as clearly demonstrated by the archaeological evidence. Nissim Arganor, for instance, informs us that Since the Bible associates the Sidonians with Canaan the son of Ham, they are still linked nowadays with the Canaanite race. However, the linguistic and cultural characteristics of the nation that inhabited the region of Sidon, as revealed by archaeological findings, are those of a Semitic people. Please bear with me, because what I am about to reveal to you is going to completely change our understanding of history. It should be noted that when King David ordered a census of the people, Tyre and Sidon were considered to be part of the census. Hence both Tyre and Sidon were Israelite cities. Think about it. Why else would King David take a census of these cities? In the 19th chapter of the book of Joshua, we are even told that Tyre and Sidon were part of Asher's inheritance. These cities were therefore under Israelite control. In the book of Amos we read, "Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they delivered up the whole captivity to Edom, and remembered not the brotherly covenant." So, what brotherly covenant did the inhabitants of Tyre have with Israel and Judah? This passage only makes sense if we accept that the people of Tyre were Israelites. The Jewish priest historian Josephus adds an interesting comment when, quoting an earlier writer by the name of Theophrastus, he informs us that the laws of the Tyrians forbid men to swear foreign oaths, a commandment which, Josephus assures us, was adopted by the Tyrians from the Jews. In those days, covenants were made by the swearing of oaths. In Genesis 21 verses 31 and 32, for example, we are told, "Wherefore he," that is Abraham, "called that place Beersheba, because there they," that is Abraham and Abimelech the king of Gerar, who was the king of the Philistines, "swear both of them." Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up, and Phicol the chief captain of his host, and they returned into the land of the Philistines. This commandment to not swear foreign oaths actually has its origin in the law of Moses, which states that the Israelites were not to make a covenant with the people of the land they were conquering, as it was bound to lead them astray. Josephus continues by saying that among those other Jewish laws which Theophrastus enumerates, there was one particular one called Korban, which oath can only be found among the Jews, and declares what a man may call a thing devoted to God. No one seems to have questioned why the men of Tyre were keeping what are considered to be Jewish laws. The rulers of Tyre were descended from Hiram, king of Tyre. Note that Hiram was not a Canaanite. In the first book of Kings, we are told that Hiram, king of Tyre, was a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass. Many have interpreted this as meaning that Hiram's mother belonged to the tribe of Naphtali. The Hebrew actually says, "Ben Isha Almanahu Mimate Naphtali," which translates literally as "son of a widow was he of the tribe of Naphtali." There is no ambiguity here. Hiram himself was of the tribe of Naphtali, which means that Hiram's father was also of the tribe of Naphtali. The Septuagint also makes it perfectly clear that Hiram belonged to the tribe of Naphtali. It says, quote, "And King Solomon sent and took Hiram out of Tyre, the son of a widow woman, and he was of the tribe of Naphtali." The Greek clearly states, "Kai otos apotis Philistis Nephthalim," and he was of the tribe of Naphtali. The second book of Chronicles also clearly states that his mother belonged to the tribe of Dan. The expression that she was a woman of the daughters of Dan means precisely that. If his mother belonged to the tribe of Dan, then his father clearly belonged to the tribe of Naphtali. Dan and Naphtali were brothers, but each gave rise to their own separate tribes. Quoting from the Babylonian Talmud, "And King Solomon sent and fetched Hiram out of Tyre. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass. And the master said, His mother was of the house of Dan. And it is written, And I, behold, I have appointed him with Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach of the tribe of Dan." The Talmud therefore also confirms that his mother belonged to the house of Dan. If his mother belonged to the tribe of Dan, then his father clearly must have belonged to the tribe of Naphtali. According to Exodus 31 verse 6, Aholiab son of Ahisamach lived during the time of Moses, and assisted Bezaleel in the construction of the tabernacle and all of its vessels. Aholiab therefore lived many centuries prior to Hiram. Consequently, the insertion of this statement in the Talmud only serves to confuse the reader. The important point to consider, however, is that the Talmudists also believe that Hiram's mother belonged to the tribe of Dan. Now, the Jewish priest historian Josephus, who for some reason errs in advising us that his mother belonged to the tribe of Naphtali, adds most enlighteningly that Hiram's father's name was Uriu, of the stock of the Israelites. So, if his father was an Israelite and his mother was an Israelite, why is everyone calling Hiram a Canaanite? I would here point out that the name Uriu is a transliteration into Greek of the Hebrew name Uriah, a name which is synonymous with the name Uranus. In Greek, Uranus means sky, whilst the Hebrew name Uriah means either God is my light or God's light, either translation being permissible. Bear in mind that the sky is effectively God's light. Furthermore, Uranus is often referred to as starry Uranus, again referring to the lights in the heavens. We shall come back to Hiram in a moment, but before we continue any further, let me introduce you to a little exercise in phonetics. The reason for this will become evident in a moment, so please bear with me. Let us start with the name Poseidon, which is in fact a variant spelling of Sidon, or Sidon as most people pronounce it, this being the name of the Phoenician city in northern Israel, which is usually mentioned in association with the city of Tyre. The Hebrew letter Sadi can be transliterated a number of different ways. It can be transliterated as an S, T, Z, ST, or even as the Greek letter Psi. The city of Sidon in northern Israel, for example, is transliterated in the authorized versions of the Bible both as Sidon with an S and as Zidon with a Z, the two forms of the names being used interchangeably. Notice how the name Sidon begins with the letter Sadi. The city of Thor in northern Israel, however, is transliterated as Tyre. Here the initial letter Sadi is transliterated as a T. The same Hebrew letter can therefore become an S, a Z, or a T. In the book of Genesis, we read that Pharaoh named the patriarch Joseph Saphnath-Paaneach. The Septuagint, as well as Josephus, both transliterate this name as either Somtom Phanech or Somtom Phanechon, where the initial letter Sadi is transliterated into Greek as Psi. Knowing this, it is not difficult to see that the name Poseidon is but a variant spelling of Sidon. Now, you will notice that I am sometimes pronouncing Poseidon and sometimes as Poseidon. I am likewise sometimes pronouncing Sidon as Sidon and sometimes as Sidon. This is intentional. The country of Iraq, for example, is called Iraq by Americans. The English pronounce the name as Iraq, the Americans as Iraq. When looking at biblical names, the English pronunciations often differ from the Hebrew pronunciations. Isaac, for example, is pronounced Yitzchak, Jacob as Yaakov, Hezekiah as Hezekiahu, Ezekiel as Yehezekel, and so on. Many other similar examples could be quoted. When doing historical research of this nature, it is imperative that we look at the original pronunciations and not their modern corrupted forms. Let's now return to our discussion of Hiram, king of Tyre. As I have demonstrated, the Greeks knew Uriah as Uranus. Cronus is said to have been the son of Uranus. Knowing this, I can reveal that the name Cronus is a phonetic variation on the name Hiram, which in Hebrew is pronounced Hiram. The phonetics involved in this change are a little more complex, but in brief, the initial Hebrew letter Chet has become a kappa when transliterated into Greek, the Hebrew letter Mem has become a nu, and with the usual US ending we find on Greek words, Hiram becomes Kiranus, becomes Cronus. It should be stressed, however, that this name Cronus is variously written Kronos, Chronon, Chronu, Chronion, and Chronides. I can likewise disclose that Cronus was also known as Chromis, son of Poseidon. Bear in mind what I have said about Poseidon being a variant spelling of Sidon, the Phoenician city. Note that Poseidon was supposedly the first to concern himself with seafaring and to fit out fleets. Cronus, that is Hiram, having given him, that is the city of Sidon, the lordship in such matters. Bear in mind that these Phoenician ships are the ones which King Solomon ordered to be built. What we are looking at here is the use of allegory. Poseidon, the god of the seas, was a city, not an actual person or a god. Welcome then to the world of allegory. According to Eusebius, Hiram was also known as Suron. Let me explain how the name Suron is a variant spelling of Yetzer, this being the third-born son of Naphtali. Notice how the letter Sadi has become an S in transliteration. Notice also how the initial letter Yod has been dropped in transliteration to form the name Suron. This is in the same way that Joshua son of Nun, for example, is called Hoshea in Numbers 13 verse 8 and in Deuteronomy 32 verse 44. In the book of Jeremiah, Jeconiah son of King Jehoiakim is also called Coniah, both names being used interchangeably. The addition of a letter N on the end of names is also well attested. You might, for example, want to consider the fact that the city of Megiddo is called Megiddon in Zechariah 12 verse 11. I would point out that the name Yetzer appears in the Authorized Version as Jezer, which again is not very helpful when studying biblical history. The Latin writers inform us that Cronus was also known as Saturn. This again is a variant spelling of Suron and of Yetzer. This time the letter Sadi of Yetzer has become an ST in transliteration. Asterius, the mythical king of Crete, was likewise the allegorical representation of the tribe of Yetzer, son of Naphtali, the Hebrew letter Sadi again becoming an ST in transliteration. Aristotle tells us that Saturn, or Saturnus as he called him, lived in the Golden Age. This Golden Age was the time of King Solomon. It was a time of peace and prosperity, not only in Israel, but in Egypt and in Assyria as well. This revelation in itself opens up a can of worms. because it shows that the Egyptian priest historian Manetho, who would have us believe that Cronus was the progenitor of the Egyptian race who lived around 4000 BCE, is deceiving us. It can be shown, however, that Manetho's various dynasties, which archaeologists are reluctant to abandon, are cleverly contrived. You might want to watch my video entitled Manetho on Trial for more information. The word Spain is the anglicised form of the Spanish name España. This in turn is the land known to the classical writers as Hispania. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas James argued that the word Hispania is derived from the Proto-Canaanite word Ishaphan, which would ordinarily mean Isle of the Rabbit, Hare or Hyrax, the Hyrax also being known as a rock coney. Apart from the fact that Ishaphan is more correctly Hebrew, not Proto-Canaanite, the suggestion that Spain was so named because of its animals, whether rabbit, hare, rock coney or whatever, is nonsense. Nevertheless, as we shall proceed to demonstrate, he was surprisingly not far off the mark with his reading of Ishaphan. Rabbi Solomon ben Virger, on the other hand, claimed that Spain was so named after one of Nebuchadnezzar's auxiliary officers by the name of Hispan or Hispanus. However, I can disclose that Spain was known as Hispania long before the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Hence, this statement is also erroneous. According to a tradition among the Spanish Jews, there have been Jews in Spain since the time of King Solomon. As we shall proceed to demonstrate, this tradition is accurate. The Latin writer Pliny, who was quoting an earlier geographer, informs us that Marcus Varro records that the whole of Spain was penetrated by invasions of Hebrews, Persians, Phoenicians, Celts and Carthagenians. The Persians arrived after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire around 300 BCE. The Carthagenians are understood to have arrived around 200 BCE, whilst the Celts are believed to have arrived around 500 BCE. This then leaves the Hebrews and Phoenicians. Herodotus records in the very first paragraph of his histories that the Phoenicians came to our sea, that is the Mediterranean, from the Red Sea as it is known. No sooner had they settled in the land they still inhabit than they turned to overseas travel. First of all, notice that they came from the Red Sea. This is where King Solomon built his fleet of ships. Remember what we said earlier when quoting the works of the Latin writer Pliny about how he said that the men of Tyre were responsible for those ships? Note also the statement by Herodotus that no sooner had they settled in the land of Phoenicia, this being the land which we know as the land of Israel, than they turned to overseas travel. In the Bible, Naphtali is described as a hind let loose. When released, a hind goes bounding off into the distance.
עופרה תשוב לטבע, קרוב למקום שבו היא נמצאה. ונותר רק לקוות שבפעם הבאה שנראה אותה בטבע, אולי כבר יהיו לה עופרים משלה. להתראות עופרה, ודש חמה למשפחה.
This then is the tribal characteristic of the tribe of Naphtali. And King Solomon made a navy of ships in Ezion Geber, which is beside Elot, on the shore of Yam Suf in the land of Edom. Yam Suf, which is translated in the authorized version as Red Sea, is more specifically the Gulf of Aqaba. And Hiram sent in the navy his servants, shipmen that had knowledge of the sea, with the servants of Solomon. For King Solomon's ships to get to the Mediterranean, which no one denies happened, they had to circumnavigate Africa. The only people in ancient times known to have accomplished this are the Phoenicians and in later times the Carthagenians. When King Solomon formed his navy, he would have used people he knew he could trust to put in charge of that navy. In 1 Chronicles chapter 8, we find in verse 22 the names Ishpan and Heber, who were sons of Shashak of the tribe of Benjamin. It is recorded that these were heads of the fathers by their generations, chief men. These dwelt in Jerusalem. They were dwelling in Jerusalem during the time of King Solomon. So think about it. These Tyrians who settled in Spain and who came from the Red Sea must have arrived during the time of King Solomon. These ships must have been those which King Solomon instructed to be built. There is also a Jewish tradition that there have been Jews in Spain since the time of King Solomon. So, in short, Ishpan called Spain Hispania, Heber called it Iberia. It is as simple as that. There is no mystery over the name of Spain, which even today, together with the country of Portugal, is known as the Iberian Peninsula, which likewise seems to have been named after Heber, son of Shashak. The river Ebro in Spain was also most likely named after this Heber, son of Shashak. When we compare this chapter of the book of Chronicles with the book of Judges, we find that Ishpan and Heber were descended from Ehud, son of Gera, son of Bela, son of Benjamin. The Greeks knew these Geraites, that is, descendants of Gera, as Geryones. Yes, the Geryones of Spain were descended from the family of Gera of the tribe of Benjamin. As stated earlier, the Greek writer Hesiod described Geryon as a man with 3 heads. Apollodorus and Aeschylus, however, both describe Geryon as 3 men joined at the waist. There is no contradiction here. They are both allegorical references to the triumvirate. When we talk of a triumvirate, we naturally assume that it was a Roman invention. It was, in fact, an Israelite Phoenician practice based on the law of Moses, which states, "At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is to die be put to death. At the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death." And again, 1 witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin in any sin that he sinneth. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall a matter be established. This then is the basis of the triumvirate, a practice which still operates to this day in a number of countries. In the United Kingdom, for example, the magistrates' court is used for minor offences. It is presided over by 3 magistrates, that is, a triumvirate. When we come to look at the Phoenician foundation of the Greek and Roman states, we shall demonstrate that many of the Greek and Roman cities were originally built by Israelites using Edomite slaves. This, however, will be left for a separate video presentation. Note that the trident in the hands of the gods Poseidon, Neptune and Britannia symbolises the triumvirate. If we start by considering the representations of Britannia, who has become the national personification of Britain as a helmeted female warrior, and who appears on numerous British coins, she is often depicted with a trident in her hands. This goddess was the Bharati of the Vedic hymns of the eastern branch of the Aryan Bharats of India. As Lawrence Waddell records, in these Vedic hymns all the attributes of Britannia are accounted for: her tutelarship of the waters and of ships, her lighthouse on the sea, her Neptune trident as well as the origin of Neptune himself and his name, her helmet and shield, as well as the cornucopia which she sometimes bears upon the Phoenician and Greco-Roman coins, taking the place of the cornstalk on the Briton coins. In these hymns it is disclosed that Barat was the mother of Napat, the son of the waters. It is recognised that Napat is a variant spelling of Neptune. We shall demonstrate in a moment that Neptune is a variant phonetic spelling of the name Naphtali. The trident was a symbol of authority and was used to mete out judgments. Quoting the Greek writer Aeschylus, "Yes, truly the day will come when Zeus, although stubborn of soul, shall be humbled, seeing that he plans a marriage that shall hurl him into oblivion from his sovereignty and throne. Such an adversary is he now preparing despite himself, a prodigy irresistible, even one who shall discover a flame mightier than the lightning, and a deafening crash to outroar the thunder. A prodigy who shall shiver the trident, Poseidon's spear, that scourge of the sea and shaker of the land." So let's unpack this allegorical tale. Zeus, who was himself zealous for the law, if he were to make an unapproved alliance, would be punished by the city of Sidon by the shaking of the trident, that is, by the enforcement of the law. Consider the expression to throw the book at someone. We don't mean that we literally throw a book. Likewise, the shaking of the trident symbolised the issuing of a warning not to break the law by breaking the alliance or covenant. Note that both Zeus and Poseidon were tribes of people. They were not actual individuals. Nor was the person Zeus was intending to marry an individual. The marriage being spoken of was an alliance between two nations which would undermine the alliance that Zeus had already made with the Phoenicians. The trident was also adopted by many of the nations over which the Phoenicians ruled. The Phoenicians also at one time held control over a part of India, more specifically the Indus Valley. In Hinduism, the trident was called a trishul and is said to have been used to fend off evildoers. In the Bhagavad Gita, a 700-verse Sanskrit scripture that is part of the Hindu epic Mahabharata, also known as the great epic of the Bharata dynasty, Bharata being a variant spelling of Britannia, it is said that the trident or the spear with 3 prongs is one of the accessories of the Lord Shiva and symbolises his 3 fundamental powers, Icha, that is will, Kriya, action, and Jnana, knowledge. It also signifies his power to destroy evil and ignorance. As his weapon and instrument of punishment, the trident represents Lord Shiva's manner of punishing evildoers on all the 3 planes: spiritual, subtle, and physical. This fanciful explanation serves to demonstrate that the trident was a symbolic representation of the judicial system. The suggestion that the 3 prongs represent will, action, and knowledge is contrived, but it nevertheless conveys the fundamental idea that these are 3 conditions which are required to make a judgment in a court of law. In other words, Icha, what was the intention, that is the will of the defendant? Kriya, were his actions legal? And Jnana, what knowledge did the defendant possess to show that he was breaking the law? That is, was he acting in ignorance? Will, action, knowledge. This is all indicative of a judicial system, more specifically one which is based on the triumvirate, a judicial system which itself has its roots in the law of Moses. Many of the early Greek writers wrote their history in allegory. Most scholars fail to understand this. They either reject these stories as foolish nonsense, consigning them to the bin labelled mythology, or they try to interpret them literally and get into difficulty when they discover that the Greek heroes inexplicably had more than the one mother and father. Consider this image. It is depicting a German soldier, who we can, for the sake of argument, call Jerry, being kicked off a map of the island of Guernsey by a donkey. However, this German soldier represents the German army, not just the one soldier. The letter V in the top left-hand corner represents a V for victory, and the ass represents the stubborn resistance to the German occupation by the islanders during the Second World War. Unless you know the history behind this picture, it would not make much sense. This sort of imagery, however, was used extensively by the early Greek writers, albeit in written form. Whilst the stories related by the Greek writers may have meant something to people at the time they were written, their meaning has since been forgotten and no longer considered relevant. Some early writers, however, recognized the allegorical nature of these Greek writings. We read, for example, that Pausanias recorded, "When I began to write my history, I was inclined to count these legends as foolishness, but on getting as far as Arcadia, I grew to hold a more thoughtful view of them, which is this. In the days of old, those Greeks who were considered wise spoke their sayings not straight out, but in riddles. And so the legends about Cronus I conjectured to be one sort of Greek wisdom. In matters of divinity, therefore, I shall adopt the received tradition." Sanchonatio, as recorded by Eusebius, likewise recorded, "All these stories Fabian, who was the very first hierophant of all the Phoenicians from the beginning, allegorized and mixed up with the physical and cosmical phenomena, and delivered to the prophets who celebrated the orgies and inaugurated the mysteries. And they, purposing to increase their vain pretensions from every source, handed them on to their successors and to their foreign visitors." These early Greek writers often turned families as well as cities into fictitious people or gods. If, as an example, we examine this passage by Appian, you will see what I mean. The Phoenicians settled Carthage in Africa 50 years before the capture of Troy. Its founders were either Zorus and Carchedon, or, as the Romans and Carthagenians themselves think, Dido, a Tyrian woman whose husband had been slain clandestinely by Pygmalion, the ruler of Tyre. Zorus is the city of Tyre, which is written Zor in Hebrew. We have already demonstrated how the letter Sadi can be transliterated either as a T or as a Z. Carchedon was the Greek name for Carthage. Carchedon is actually a variant spelling of the Hebrew name Carchadash. The Phoenicians called it Carthagedashat. Carter, which is equivalent to the Hebrew word Kiryat, means city, whilst Chadash or Chadashat means new. Bear in mind that there is no value in the Greek language for an SH sound, so the Greeks could not transliterate the name precisely. Otherwise they would have had to call the city Carhades, which in the Greek language would have meant city of hell. Carthage was in fact a garden city, far from being a city of hell. You will notice that neither Zorus nor Carchedon were actual people. They are the names of cities which have been turned into fictional people. This is how allegory works. Let us look at a further example, this time from the Greek historian Thucydides. Thus, in the 60th year after the fall of Troy, the Boeotian people, having been expelled from Arne by the Thessalians, settled in the country formerly called Cadmeus, but now Boeotia. A portion of the tribe already dwelt there, and some of these had joined in the Trojan expedition. In the 80th year after the war, the Dorians, led by the Heraclidae, conquered the Peloponnesus. Diodorus, another Greek historian, informs us that Boetus, the mythical progenitor of the Boeotians, was the son of Arne and Poseidon. As already stated, Poseidon is identifiable as the city of Sidon in northern Israel. In other words, the Boeotians were transported by Phoenician ships from Thessaly to central Greece. Here, Boetus becomes the allegorical representation of the Boeotian people. The Sidonian ships become Poseidon, the father of the semi-mythical Boetus. Notice also how the city of Arne, from which Thucydides informs us the Boeotians were expelled, becomes the mother of this semi-mythical Boetus. Yes, this is how allegory works. Neptune was likewise a tribal element, and not a god at all. Neptune is actually a variant spelling of the Hebrew name Naphtali. The interchange of the letters N and L in ancient languages is well attested. Nabonidus, king of Babylon, for example, was called Labanettus by Herodotus. The 12th dynasty pharaoh Amenemhat III, whose prenomen was Nemare, was likewise variably called Lachares, Lamares, Lampares, Labares, Mares or Moris by the Greek writers. Notice how the first letter, which is an N in the Egyptian, is often transliterated as an L. Those familiar with the works of Josephus, especially if they look at the Greek or Thackeray's translation in the Loeb Classical Library series, will know that he called Reuben either Rubel or Rubelos. The letters P and F were also interchangeable in ancient languages. For Neptune we can read Neptule or Neftule. Neptune, who was known as the god of the sea, was the tribe of Naphtali who ruled the seas. Note that Neptune was the Roman name for the god Poseidon. Naphtali came from the cities of Tyre and Sidon. If you can recall, Hiram, king of Tyre, belonged to the tribe of Naphtali. Hopefully you are now starting to see how this all fits together. Having had a brief introduction to allegory, let us now return to our story of the Geryones of Spain. Concerning Geryon, the fictitious king of Spain, Apollodorus wrote, "At a 10th labour he, that is Heracles, was ordered to fetch the kine of Geryon from Erythea. Now Erythea was an island near the ocean. It is now called Gadira. This island was inhabited by Geryon, son of Chrysaor, by Callirhoe, daughter of Ocean. He had the body of 3 men grown together and joined in one at the waist, but parted in 3 from the flanks and thighs. He owned red kine, of which Eurytion was the herdsman, and Orthus the 2-headed hound, begotten by Typhon on Echidna, was the watchdog. But Menuettes, who was there pasturing the kine of Hades, reported to Geryon what had occurred. First of all, let me explain that the red kine were not cattle. They were Edomite slaves being used by the Phoenicians to undertake their mining activities for them. As already explained, Gadira is the place we today know as Cadiz. We read in chapter 4 verse 1 of the book of Amos, "Hear this word, ye kine of Bashan, that are in the mountain of Samaria, which oppress the poor, which crush the needy, which say to their masters, Bring and let us drink." Do we think that the prophet is referring to actual cattle? No, the kine of Bashan mentioned here, which were oppressing the people, were people in authority. Similarly, the red kine of Geryon were people. I should here point out that the Hebrew word eved, which is often translated in the Bible as servant, can mean servant or slave. In biblical Hebrew, there is no distinction between these 2 words, which in English have 2 significantly different meanings. This word eved is derived from the verb meaning simply to work. It is a well-known fact that the Phoenicians used slave labour. What is perhaps not so well known or appreciated is that King Solomon, like it or not, also used slave labour, as confirmed by Josephus. But King Solomon subdued to himself the remnant of the Canaanites that had not before submitted to him. Those that dwelt in Mount Lebanon and as far as the city Hamath, and ordered them to pay tribute. He also chose out of them every year such as were to serve him in the meanest offices, and to do his domestic works, and to follow husbandry. For none of the Hebrews were servants in such low employments, nor was it reasonable that when God had brought so many nations under their power, they should depress their own people to such mean offices of life, rather than those nations. While all the Israelites were concerned in warlike affairs, and were in armour, and were set over the chariots and the horses, rather than leading the life of slaves. He appointed also 550 rulers over those Canaanites who were reduced to such domestic slavery, who received the entire care of them from the king, and instructed them in those labours and operations wherein he wanted their assistance. Returning to our story of Heracles and the red kine, we are told that Menuettes was pasturing the kine. The Hebrew letter shin can become a T when transliterated into other languages. As one of many examples which could be quoted, Josephus called Bashan in northern Israel both Batanidi and Batanaean. The latter was also the name for Bashan employed by Ptolemy. Menuettes was the tribe of Manasseh, pronounced Manasseh in the Hebrew tongue. Menuettes is but a variant spelling of this name. They were pasturing the kine. To put this in simple terms, they, that is the tribe of Manasseh, were supplying the slave labour. This will become more evident when we consider the Greek history, which we will cover in another video. Eurytion, who is described as a herdsman, is better known to us as a family named after Arad or Arodi, son of Gad, Eurytion being a phonetic variation on this name. The interchange of the letters T and D in ancient languages is also well attested. The tribe of Gad were responsible for the workers' general well-being, making sure that they were fed and watered and kept them from running away. This is what is meant by herdsman. Some of these descendants of Gad became the Gaditani of Spain, mentioned by the Greek writers Herodotus, Strabo and others. The Latin writer Pliny also mentions a people in Spain called Oritani. The name Oritani is another variant spelling of the name Arodi, the letter Dalit or D having become a T in transliteration. The Oritani were clearly a breakaway faction of Gaditani. Following this through to its natural conclusion, Orthus, who is described as a two-headed hound, is a family named after Ard, son of Benjamin. I can only surmise from the use of the phrase two-headed hound that Orthus, that is the tribe of Ard, son of Benjamin, was in charge of guiding and directing the slaves at the working face of the mine, making sure that they did not turn to the right or to the left, hence the symbolic two heads. And believe it or not, the name Chrysaor is a transliteration of the Hebrew name Yaxiel, this being the name of the firstborn son of Naphtali. If I pronounce the name Yaxiel as Yachior, you can probably just about work out the phonetics involved in the transliteration. The name Yaxiel appears in the authorized version as Jaziel, which I admit is hardly very helpful when studying biblical history. Heracles, who went to Spain to retrieve the red kine, was likewise not a person but an Edomite tribe descended from Duke Ruel. I would here point out that because of the letter Ein in the middle of the word, the name Ruel is transliterated as Raguel by Josephus. The letter ein is a guttural and can be transliterated a number of different ways. We shall be looking at some examples of this in a short while. Heracles is but another variant spelling of this name. I should perhaps also mention that the Heracles were a powerful Edomite family who at one time ruled southern Greece. Those familiar with the history of Alexander the Great will know that he claimed to be of Heraclid descent. Heracles, who went to fetch the red kine from the Geryones, was not a person but a tribe. Even Herodotus challenged the assumption that he was a single person. He put it succinctly when he wrote, "Besides this, how is it in nature possible that Heracles, being one person only, and moreover a man as they assert, should slay many myriads?" Bear in mind that, like Geryon, Heracles was considered a god. This is how the Greek legends have been formed. They have turned tribal entities as well as names of cities into fictitious people. The Phoenicians therefore comprised a number of Israelite tribes. They were certainly not Canaanites as most textbooks would have us believe. You will note that Geryon is called son of Chrysaor. If Geryon belonged to the tribe of Benjamin, and Chrysaor belonged to the tribe of Yaxiel son of Naphtali, then Geryon could not possibly have been a son of Chrysaor. Again, we need to bear in mind that this is allegory. What the writer is telling us in an allegorical way is that these Geryones were brought to Spain by the tribe of Naphtali, or more specifically by the tribe of Yaxiel son of Naphtali. The word son is not to be read literally. The same goes for his so-called mother, Callirhoe. Ptolemy reveals that Callirhoe was actually the name of a city to the east of the Dead Sea. The coordinates Ptolemy gives for the city of Callirhoe roughly correlate to the ancient city of Aroer. Philologically, Callirhoe is but a phonetic variation on this name Aroer. Note that Aroer is written with two ions. Being a guttural, the letter ion has a peculiar property. Sometimes it is transliterated as an O, as in Omri, king of Israel. Sometimes as a G, as in Gomorrah, which is written with the same Hebrew characters as Omri, apart from the final letter. Note incidentally that the Hebrew reads from right to left. The letter ayin is the letter on the right. The name Gaza likewise begins with this same letter ayin. However, notice that in 3 places in the King James Bible, that is Deuteronomy 2 verse 23, 1 Kings 4 verse 24 and Jeremiah 25 verse 20, this same name, written with the same Hebrew characters, is transliterated as Azza rather than Gaza. This city of Aroer to the east of the Dead Sea was built by the tribe of Gad. This is where the Gaditani of Spain came from. This region to the east of the river Jordan was specifically Gad and Reuben's possession. As a point of reference, the city of Gazaras, which Ptolemy places to the northeast of Aroer, is clearly the biblical city of Yahzeh, the initial letter Yod having been dropped in pronunciation, and the Hebrew letter Ayin being transliterated as a G. In the authorized version of the Bible, the name is written Jazer. Philologically, Gazaras is a variant spelling of the Hebrew name, which can be pronounced Yagazer. If you can recall, Yehoshua son of Nun was also called Hoshea, and Jechoniah king of Judah was also called Coniah. This dropping of the initial syllable was commonplace. We shall encounter further similar examples in a moment. Callirhoe was therefore a place name, and not the literal biological mother of Geryon, as is commonly assumed. If we look at this map of ancient Spain, This is where the city of Cadiz is located. As already stated, the Phoenicians called the city Gadir, this being a Hebrew word meaning fence, a reading which is confirmed by the Latin writer Pliny. Tartessus is understood to have been somewhere inland from Cadiz. This is where the Phoenicians undertook their mining operations. Tartessus is a variant spelling of Tarshish, this being the place mentioned in Jeremiah 10 verse 9 from where silver was sourced, with the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 27 verse 12 adding that iron, tin and lead also came from Tarshish. Notice how the first instance of the Hebrew letter shin in the name Tarshish has become a T in transliteration. This is in the same way that Bashan was called Batanaean by Josephus and Ptolemy. Bear in mind also that there is no letter to represent an SH value in the Greek alphabet. Consequently, the second instance of the letter shin in Tarshish becomes an S in transliteration. We therefore have a textbook philological progression, with Tarshish becoming Tartis, which, with the typical US suffix added to words when transliterated into Greek, becomes Tartessus. The Greeks sometimes called this place Tartarus, the names Tartarus and Tartessus being used interchangeably. The Greek writer Apollodorus describes Tartarus as a gloomy place in Hades, as far distant from earth as earth is distant from the sky. Hesiod, another Greek writer, describes the place as being far beneath the earth as heaven is above earth, for so far is it from earth to Tartarus. For a brazen anvil falling down from heaven 9 nights and days would reach the earth upon the 10th. And again, a brazen anvil falling from earth 9 nights and days would reach Tartarus upon the 10th. This is a slight exaggeration, but it aptly describes how far underground these mining operations went. The Phoenician city of Caslon, sometimes written Caslona, was located inland about 250 miles northeast of Cadiz. Notice how the S and the Z are typical transliterations of the Hebrew letter Sadi. This city was called Caslon by Strabo. It was called Castellonis by Pliny. The ST form is also a typical transliteration of the Hebrew letter Sadi. In some copies of the works of Josephus, for example, Josephus has transliterated the Hebrew name Mitzrayim, the ancient name for Egypt, as Mestre. These people of Caslon or Caslona later formed the kingdom of Castille. This name Castille is a phonetic variation on the Hebrew name Yachtziel, who was the firstborn son of Naphtali. In Hebrew, Yachtziel means cut off by God. Notice once again how the initial letter Yod has been dropped in pronunciation. In all the English translations I have looked at, this name Yachtziel is written Jaziel, which is not at all helpful when doing any biblical study such as this. You have to go back to the original Hebrew in order to make these connections. In around 825 BCE, this being according to conventional dating, which I am challenging, under the leadership of Queen Elissa, though the Latin writer Virgil called her Queen Dido, a group of Phoenicians abandoned Tyre and established a colony on the North African coast in the most fertile part of the coastline. Strabo describes this coastline as follows. Most of the coast next to us is very fertile, more especially about the Cyrenaic and the part about Carthagena, as far as Marussia and the Pillars of Heracles. Pliny tells us that the hills surrounding the city of Carthage were shaded by dense woods and watered by gushing springs on the side facing Africa, where fruits of all kinds spring up of their own accord with such luxuriance that pleasure never lacks satisfaction. The Phoenicians called the city Karchadash or Kartachadashat. This is a Hebrew name meaning new city. It was most certainly not a Canaanite city. The Romans called the city Cartagena, Carthagena, Carthageniensis or Carthago, all of which are variations on the Hebrew Kiryat Guni, meaning city of Guni. Guni being the name of the second-born son of Naphtali. The name Guni means my garden. It is interesting to note, therefore, that Carthage was considered a garden city. The Latin writer Virgil called Carthage Agenor, this being the Dorian spelling of Guni. We are told that the act of adding the letter R on names was a Dorian practice. In another video, I shall demonstrate that the Dorians were Israelites from the city of Dor in northern Israel, and that these Dorians started arriving in Greece no earlier than the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, this being when Hezekiah was king of Judah. This will, however, take too long to explain here. It has been noticed that the name Agenor, when translated into Phoenician, becomes Cana or Canas, which names are variant spellings of the Hebrew name Guni. The suggestion by scholars that Cana or Canas is equivalent to the Hebrew word Canaan is therefore shown to be wrong. This false teaching comes to us from Eusebius, who interpreted this word Cana from the works of an earlier writer by the name of Sanchoniaton as referring to Canaan. He even informs us that Cana was the brother to Osiris, where Osiris is the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew name Yetzer, this being the name of the third-born son of Naphtali. When these Carthagenians arrived in Spain, they settled in a fertile area of the country. Strabo informs us that the whole coast from the Pillars up to this place is in need of harbours, but all the way from here to Emporium, the countries of Aleatani, Velatalete and others are both furnished with excellent harbours and fertile. According to Pliny, Tarragon in Spain was established by the Roman Scipios. Reading between the lines, he seems to suggest that the Scipio family were originally of Spanish descent. But let us not allow ourselves to get detracted from the main topic under discussion. It is argued that Tarragon is not a Latin word. William Smith attempted to read it as Tarchon, saying it is a Phoenician word meaning citadel. Pliny and Strabo call this colony Tarraco, Tarracon or Tarraconensis. Compare this with the Latin forms Carthago, Cartagena and Cartagenensis. Tarragon means literally land of Guni, Latin terra as in terra firma, as well as territory. Finisterre at the northwest tip of Spain likewise means land's end, finis as in finish or end, and terra meaning land. Aragon is a contraction of the name Tarragon, the initial letter T having dropped out in pronunciation. I have come across a similar example of this dropping of the initial letter T elsewhere. The Manaeans of Sargon II, Sennacherib and Esarhaddon's records, for example, were the people called Temanites by Adad-nirari II, an earlier king of Assyria, and they were called Temanaeans by Herodotus, who lived at a much later date. This tribe of people were therefore occupying the selfsame territory throughout the whole of this period, but whilst Adad-nirari and Herodotus called them Temanites, Sargon II, Sennacherib and Esarhaddon refer to them as Manaeans. Another example that can be cited is the fact that the Welsh name for the town of Lachan in Carmarthenshire in South Wales is Talachan. Again, note the dropping of the initial letter T when transliterated into English. I therefore see the name Aragon as being a contraction of the name Tarragon. In part 2, we shall look at the other two sons of Naphtali, who also settled in Spain, these being Yetzer and Shilem, the latter being called Shalom in the first book of Chronicles. We shall also look at the implications of the Islamic occupation of Spain and look at the great influence the Spanish have had on literature and on European culture, thereby fulfilling the prophecy that Naphtali giveth goodly words. And we shall consider the relevance of the prophecy that Naphtali should possess the west and the south, a prophecy which was not fulfilled whilst they were dwelling in the land of Israel, and which only saw its fulfilment in recent times. So join me in part 2 for more enlightenment.